All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring a really atmospheric mystery, the central idea of a nation whose entire foundation rests on something totally intangible. Normally, when we think of how a country is built, we picture, solid ground, right? Physical borders, monumental stone buildings, that sort of thing. But today, we're focusing on Portugal. And we're going to unpack this incredibly provocative idea from our source material that Portugal is actually the only country in the world built on what's called a sacred void. So, how exactly is a country built on a void? Take a second and just think about that paradox. Nations are built on land. They're built on soil, on rock, on physical resources that people have literally fought over for centuries. But our source material completely challenges this physical assumption. It asks us to kind of slow down and peel back the layers of this cultural mystery, to find something entirely invisible sitting right at the core of the Portuguese identity. It's this massive, deliberate shift in how we look at the foundation of a society. We're moving away from what we can touch to what we can only feel. And the answer to that huge mystery actually comes down to a single word: Saudade. Now, the heavy visual weight of this word here is completely intentional because it's meant to anchor a really massive cultural weight. Saudade isn't just your standard vocabulary word. It's this profound Portuguese concept that famously completely defies a direct English translation. There's really no one-to-one equivalent. It is the literal essence of that sacred void we just mentioned. It represents this deep, almost melancholic longing, an intense yearning for something or someone that's just absent. It's literally the feeling of emptiness being given a structural form and real cultural substance. Now, what's really fascinating here is how we can literally map out this entirely intangible feeling by using a few vivid sensory elements as our roadmap. We are, essentially, visualizing the void together. First up, the source points us to the weathered armillary sphere, which is this classic symbol of navigation and astronomy and exploration. Next, we have the crashing Atlantic horizon. That represents the vast, sometimes terrifying, but incredibly beautiful unknown that completely define their geography. And finally, a dancing white handkerchief. Now, these aren't just random historical objects. They make up the specific visual vocabulary of Saudade. They give a real, tangible shape to an emotion that you otherwise just couldn't hold in your hands. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast between traditional nation building and what's happening in Portugal. On the one hand, you have your standard physical architecture. Things built out of stone, drawn up with strict lines on a map, organized into big, noisy cities. But on the flip side, we have the architecture of Saudade. The building blocks here are just completely different. Instead of bricks, they are a sacred void, a profound sense of longing, and an entire collective nervous system. It really shows us a nation that's constructed entirely on a foundation of emotional resonance, rather than just mortar and military borders. So to really understand how any country adopts longing as its foundational structure, we have to look back at the historical forge that created it, and that is the Age of Discovery. This was the time when Portuguese ships were constantly pushing out into that endless, crashing Atlantic horizon we just visualized. They were out there charting the unknown globe using that armillary sphere. But, as our source highlights, this era did way more than just map out new trade routes or expanded empire. It actually fundamentally altered the psychology of the people who were left behind on the shore. Our source material describes this psychological shift in a really brilliant way. It says, the Age of Discovery forged a national nervous system. I just want you to really absorb that phrase for a second. It's incredibly powerful. Yes, the physical borders of the empire were expanding all across the globe, but at the exact same time, this deep, collective sense of Saudade was being actively wired into the very nerves of the populace. Every single time a ship departed, it stretched those nerves across oceans. It created this permanent, vibrating frequency of absence, of anticipation, and of deep yearning right inside the culture itself. To kind of ground this huge, sweeping historical concept, let's zoom in on a really intense, personal, and poetic visual: a white handkerchief dancing in a dark window. When we talk about things like a national nervous system or the massive scope of the Age of Discovery, it can all feel a little abstract, right? But this image, this is perfectly, completely human. This is the wife, the mother, the child, standing alone in the isolating darkness of a window, waving a handkerchief as a ship disappears over the horizon. It just perfectly captures the intimate human scale of waiting and distance. It is the real lived experience of all that heavy, elegant longing. It is the real lived experience of all that heavy, elegant longing. When we take all these evocative elements and put them together, we arrive at what's called a superimposed identity. Think of it like a layered, cinematic picture of an entire nation's longing.
You take that stone-textured armillary sphere right from the center of the modern Portuguese flag, and you superimpose it over the raw, natural power of the crashing ocean. And then all of it is framed by that isolating darkness we just saw in the window. This is way more than just a cool artistic aesthetic. It is the ultimate visual representation of Saudade. It's a composite image showing exactly how a culture sees itself, defined not just by what is physically there, but deeply, deeply defined by what is out there, somewhere beyond the waves. And here is the absolute crucial point. Saudade is a sacred space. The whole architecture of Saudade tells us that this longing, this vast void that was created by distance and time and exploration, is absolutely not an emptiness to be pitied. It isn't some flaw in the national character, and it certainly isn't a trauma that needs to be fixed or somehow filled in. Our source material makes it incredibly clear that this longing is a poetically validated destination all on its own. The longing is the point. It is a profoundly protected and revered aspect of their identity. Just sit with that idea for a moment. A sacred space. By actually acknowledging Saudade as sacred, the culture elevates human longing to something almost holy. The emotional void left by those who sailed away, the huge distance between what currently is and what formerly was, that void is actually the most foundational, sacred space in the entire country. It acts as an invisible monument, a monument that isn't built out of stone or steel, but is constructed entirely out of the sheer, unyielding power of memory, absence, and enduring love. So all of this leaves us with a pretty provocative question. What invisible emotion serves as the architecture of your culture? We've seen today how Portugal built its profound identity upon the sacred void of Saudade, literally wiring a beautiful collective longing directly into its national nervous system. But what about where you're from? If you peeled back the physical borders and the stone cities of your own home, what emotion is really holding it all together? I really hope this sparks some deep curiosity for you. Thanks for joining me to explore this incredibly poetic source material. And hey, keep questioning the invisible foundations of the world around you.